Good morning and happy Sabbath again. It is a privilege to be here in the house of God, and it is a privilege to see all of you here as well. Today I'd like to start a series of subjects that has to do with world events, and specifically we'll be focusing on what has been in the past and how does it affect us today. We will be touching the trumpets. We will be looking at Islam in prophecy, how all of that plays a role, and how does that affect you and me personally. In book of Daniel, we find a statement that is made by Daniel himself, and this is sort of ripped out of that statement. We will see it a bit later, but Daniel was talking to Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, he removes kings and he sets up kings. We're all concerned as to what will be in the future. What is tomorrow going to bring? And it's a very valid question. Sometimes God decides to hide the tomorrow from us because he wants us to exercise faith. But a lot of times God does open the tomorrow to us through the prophecy. If we study and verse by verse, point by point, we find out what God has stored for us in the future. I'd like to go back all the way to the beginning of the Bible, and we'll go to the book of Genesis. God found himself a faithful man by the name Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 12:1, he says, "The Lord hath said to Abraham, Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Jesus personally invited Abraham to come out amidst the idolatry that he was in. Abraham listened to the Lord, to the call that came from the Lord. Him and his father and his nephew Lot exited the land of Ur, and they became pilgrims in the land where God was taking Abraham. A few years later, God again comes to Abraham, and he tells him in Genesis chapter 15, verse 5, "And he brought him forth outdoors and said, Look now toward heaven and count the stars, if thou be able to number them. He said unto them, So shall thy seed be." Because Abraham was faithful to the Lord, God wanted to make a great nation from Abraham. His goal was to preserve the Bible and to preserve the beliefs that God instilled in Abraham for the future generations. And as we trace and follow what was happening in the next generations, then we can see where the God's plan was truly being followed, or did the people derail from the path that God chose for them, and God had to adjust his plans according to make sure that the end goal is still reached. So as we talked about Abraham, then God calls him out of the land of Ur. Then Isaac is born unto Abraham, and in this particular instance, do you remember who else was born to Abraham before Isaac? Ishmael. Ishmael and Isaac, they were stepbrothers. And again, because Abraham did not follow God's plan as it was initially stated to him, he decided to choose his own path as well. Today we have two stepbrothers, two nations that came from two stepbrothers. They're constantly fighting at each other. As you can see, what was the result of one mistake on Abraham's part, but that's for a later study. So Isaac is born. To Isaac there were two sons are born. One of them is Jacob. To Jacob there were 12 sons that were born, and one of them was Joseph. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery as a slave, and he ended up in Egypt. In Egypt, he stayed faithful to the Lord, and God blessed him. He becomes the ruler of Egypt. a bit later, Jacob and his family, they move to Egypt, where Joseph is taking care of them. Jacob died in Egypt. Joseph died in Egypt. And through all this time, they were in Egypt, and we know through the prophecy, we know through the Bible that even through the prophecy to Abraham was told that they will become slaves in Egypt. They left God, they departed from the scripture, and God was able to use that lesson to punish them, to bring them back to Him. Then we know that Moses is born. Moses becomes as a promised son who would become a deliverer. Moses makes mistakes because he tries again to take the plans of God into his own hands, and God has to re-educate Moses. And then eventually Moses comes back. He listens to God's call. He comes back. Through Moses, God is able to deliver the people from Egypt, and they exit Egypt and they go to Mount Sinai. As they travel through the wilderness, they do not listen to God again. They have their own plans. They have their own wishes. They want to do what they want to do. And as the result of this, we find in the Bible, it says, for the people of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the nation, the men of war that came forth out of Egypt, perished because they did not hearken to the voice of the Lord. To them the Lord swore that He would not let them see the land which the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. The result of disobedience to the Lord was that they were on the brink of entering the promised land. But because they did not show faith, because they did not want to follow God's leading, they murmured, they complained. God said, because of this, you will go back into the wilderness. You will wander for 40 years until the generation that murmured will perish in the wilderness, and then I will bring you back into the promised land. Moses finishes his ministry on the earth. God tells him that he has to go up to Mount Nebo and he is to die there. Joshua takes over from Moses, and this is what happens. And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of its feet of the priests that bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth shall rest in the waters of Jordan, that the waters of Jordan shall be cut off from the waters that come down from above, and they shall stand upon a heap. The end of the 40 years the end of 40-year journey comes to an end. They are ready to cross into the promised land. Joshua is in charge of the camp. God speaks to Joshua, and God gives him instructions of what has to be done. Through this, they cross the Jordan River, and they are entering into the promised land. And this is where they conquer Jericho. This is where they conquer Ai, and they later settle in the land. But why did God choose people of Israel to begin with? What was the purpose that God was trying to achieve by choosing the people of Israel? Well, follow me to the Testimonies to the Church, Volume 5, where we read the following. The Lord called out His people of Israel and separated them from the world that He might commit to them a sacred trust. He made them the depositories of His law, and He designed through them to preserve among men the knowledge of Himself. Through them, the light of heaven was to shine out to the dark places of the earth, and a voice was to be heard appealing to all the peoples to turn away from the idolatry, to serve the living and the true God. Had the Hebrews been true to their trust, there would have been a power in the world. God would have been their defense, and He would have exalted them above all other nations. His light and truth would have been revealed through them, and they would have stood forth under His wise and holy rule as an example of the superiority of His government over every form of idolatry. So Jesus chose the Jewish nation, or people of Israel, to be the light to shine to others. That was the purpose that God was pursuing. If they would have been true to the call that God made, then the world as we know today would have been completely different. But unfortunately, self appeared. And this is the result. As they settled in the promised land, God told them to go and conquer the other nations, subdue them, and destroy some of them. They did that to a certain extent, and then they stopped because they were satisfied with what they conquered. And God told them that they will, because you haven't conquered them, there will be constantly a thorn in your side. As they settled in the land of promise, in the promised land, God instituted a system where judges were elected to sort of govern the people of Israel. So there's a list of judges that you can see. But if you look at the enemy or the oppressor, there was always someone that was at their side attacking them or trying to cause trouble. We have the Mesopotamians, we have the Moabites, the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Ammonites. It's the nations that were not destroyed. But what was the reason for that? Well, if you look at the cycle of Judges, Israel sins. One, the result of this is the enemy oppresses. Result of this, people of Israel cry out to God. God raises a judge. Peace in the land. And then the circle continues, 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 and continues. There were good judges. There were judges that did not have any enemies attacking them through their term. And there were judges where God had to punish people because, again, they were not listening to the Lord. Now, as we move further, we go to some of the judges that we know, Jephthah, Samson, and the last judges, 2 judges were Eli and Samuel. And after this, do you remember what was the request that was made by people of Israel to the judge? Give us a king. They wanted to be like other nations. Rather than being governed by God, they chose to be governed by a king. When Samuel heard this, he was very, very upset. But God said, they did not reject you, they have rejected me. So the first king is chosen. It was Saul. The first king was Saul, and the second king was David, and the third king was Solomon. Under these 3 kings, Israel existed as a united nation. But after Solomon, Rehoboam, his son, takes over. And rather than listening to the advice of the old advisors of Solomon, who suggested to him, look, lower the taxes, make life easier for the people, Rehoboam listens to the advice of the younger judges. And because he listened to the advice, people said, that's it. We have nothing to do. Let's just disperse and let's do our own thing. So the nation was divided into 2 parts, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Israel. This was all prophesied earlier as well, which we will look in another study. But as the time goes on, there were many, many kings in both the southern kingdom and in the northern kingdom. But what I'd like us to point attention to is that through all of this, just like through the judges, God is punishing people of Israel by attacks from other nations. And one of the nations that becomes prominent is Assyria. Assyria starts attacking Israel in about 752 or so. This is the first major Assyrian intervention. They had to pay a large tribute to the king of Assyria of 1,000 talents, and to allow the people of Israel to exist as a nation. Then we go further. Assyria in 2 Kings chapter 15, 742 to 740. Assyria conquered, continued to demand more tribute. And then in the last, under King Hosea, Assyrians besieged Samaria for 3 years, and they captured the city in 722 BC. So again, the events that could have been prevented if people of God would have listened to the Lord, they were not. And as a result, God was punishing them and allowing heathen nations to come and conquer. So Israel fell before Judah because they were divided. In 722, Israel falls to Assyria. Assyria comes, attacks, takes Samaria, and that's it. The Israel in itself does not exist anymore as a nation. They were under Assyrians. Judah, on the other hand, they were more faithful to the Lord. So when the Assyrians came to conquer Jerusalem under Hezekiah, he prayed to the Lord, and through Isaiah, he was given what to do and how to make sure that they would have survived. And we know from the Bible that in one instance, an angel came and he destroyed an Assyrian army. And Assyrians basically scurried back to where they were, and they would not attack again Judah. So for another 150 years, they survived until we come to the Babylonian Empire in 586 BC. So the Babylonians themselves, they rose to power in about 626 BC when Nabopolassar rebelled against the Assyrian Empire. So basically, Babylonians were under the Assyrians, but then they rebelled against the Assyrians and they conquered them. And in 612, Babylon allied with Medes and destroyed Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. And after that, Babylon became the dominant empire of that region. So this is where we come to the vision, not to the vision, but to the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 2. So, Judah's final chapter. The first attack of Babylon came in 605 BC. This is when Nebuchadnezzar II attacks Jerusalem. This is where he takes Daniel and his friends and many, many other young men as captives. This happened under King Joachim. The second deportation happened in 597 as well. Ezekiel was exiled. And in 586, they come back, Babylonians come back. This was during the king of Zedekiah. And they destroy the temple. Jerusalem is burned. And this is where Israel does not exist anymore as a nation. Judah does not exist anymore as a nation. They were completely annihilated. So, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. So, Nebuchadnezzar wants to know what's going to happen in the future. So, to answer that question, God sends him a dream. He sends him a dream, and then he takes away the dream from him. So, Nebuchadnezzar wakes up totally confused. He knows it was an important dream. He has no idea what it was. So he calls his magicians, astrologers, and he tells them, look, I had a dream. You need to tell me what it was, and you need to tell me what does it mean. Those guys are puzzled. They're like, never a king has asked for anything like that. How could we do that? Daniel hears about that. He goes, he negotiates a bit more time because the result of this disobedience was death. The decree was passed. They were to be killed. Daniel goes, negotiates with the king, gets a bit more time, goes to God, prays to God. God offers him God opens up to him that dream and the interpretation. So Daniel goes back to the king. So we go to Daniel chapter 2, verses 27 and 28. It says, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, show unto the king. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secret, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the later days. So this is where Daniel comes to Nebuchadnezzar and says, look, I can't do it, but God can. And he reveals to him the dream. Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 and 33. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. The image head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. And then he continues, Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of the iron and clay, and brake them into pieces. Then was the iron and the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like chaff of the summer's thresholdings. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mount, and filled the whole earth. So this is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. And he is baffled as to how could Daniel remember or know what the king dreamt, and he recited that to every single detail. But Daniel goes on. It says, O king, thou art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. And whatsoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field, the fowls of heaven, hath he given into thine hand, and hath made thee ruler over them. Thou art the head of gold. So, Babylonian Empire, as I mentioned, they became established in 626 BC. Nabopolassar established the Neo-Babylon Empire. 605, Babylon becomes the world power. Nebuchadnezzar II defeated Egypt in the Battle of Carchemish. Babylon becomes the dominant empire of the ancient and Near East. 586, they destroy Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed. Many Jews were taken captive to Babylon. 539 BC, there was a fall of Babylon. Babylon fell to the Medo-Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. So Babylon in itself did not exist as an empire for a very long time, as you can see. So 626 to 539, Babylon existed as an empire for about 87 years. But only from 605 to 539 BC, Babylon ruled as the dominant world empire for only about 66 years. So it's a relatively short period when they were actually in power. But they were magnificent power. Because in the image of that Nebuchadnezzar had, which part of the statue represented Babylon? Did you catch that? The head of gold. Because below that, they were much more inferior metals. The head of gold, the breast of silver, the thighs of brass, and the legs of iron. So Babylon ruled, but not for very long. After Babylon, verse 39, after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee. What happened is, you have to scroll forward to Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar was the king of the Chaldeans. And it says that in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom. It's another study, but what happened is that there was a great feast for many, many days. In their drunkenness, Belshazzar ordered to bring the vessels from the temple. They brought them in, and they started partying, and they started drinking wine from those vessels. And do you remember what was the result of that? What appeared on the wall? A hand that said, many, many tekel uforeseen. There has been weighed and found wanting, in a nutshell. So that was the fall of the Babylon Empire. So the Medo-Persian Empire also, began when the Persians united with and eventually absorbed the Medes under the leadership of Cyrus the Great. So 678 to 550, rise of Medes. The Medes became a powerful kingdom in the reign of the modern Iran. They helped destroy the Assyrian Empire alongside Babylon in 1612 BC. But in 559, Cyrus began to rule. He became the king of Persians in Anshan. At this time, Persia was still under the Median influence. In 550, Medes and Persians, they unite. Cyrus defeats the Astyages. They united the Median Persia. They united under one empire. So in 550, that's where they usually start counting the establishment of the Medo-Persian Empire. In 539, the Babylon is conquered. Cyrus conquered Babylon without major destruction. The Medo-Persian Empire becomes the dominant world empire. In 538, the Jews are allowed to return. Cyrus issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. We find this recorded in Ezra. So the Medo-Persian Empire lasted from 550 to 330 BC, so about 220 years in total. And then we go further. And another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So this is the beginning of the Greek Empire. In 336, Alexander becomes a king. Alexander became king of Macedonia after the death of his father, Philip, second of Macedon. In 334, he begins his conquest. Alexander crossed into Asia and began conquering the Persian Empire. In 331, Persia was defeated. Alexander defeated Darius III. The Medo-Persian Empire effectively fell, and Greece became the dominant world empire. So, Alexander the Great himself did not rule for a very long time, only from 331 to 323 BC, for about 8 years. He died at the age of 32. After him, there were 4 generals that squabbled to begin with, and then the kingdom was divided into 4 parts. It was Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy. They spread out in the territory that was conquered, and they all ruled their respective territories. So, again, the Greek Empire, Alexander becomes the king. The Greek conquest of Persia begins. Persia is defeated. Alexander dies in 323. And in 146, Greece falls under Roman rule, because we know that there was the 4th kingdom. And Daniel 2:40 tells us that, and the 4th kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all this, shall it break in pieces and bruise. So the Roman Empire in itself, it started way earlier than 146. So we go all the way to 753 BC. The traditional founding of Rome. Rome was traditionally founded by Romulus. In 509, Roman Republic begins. The Roman king is overthrown. Rome becomes a republic governed by Senate. From 264 to 146, it was the Punic Wars. Rome fights Carthage in 3 major wars. Rome becomes the dominant in the Western Mediterranean. And in 146, Rome destroys Corinth, and Greece comes under the Roman control. And then we go further. In 63 BC, Rome comes to Jerusalem. They recapture Jerusalem. In 27 BC, Roman Empire officially is established. Augustus becomes the first emperor, beginning of the Roman Empire. This is where Christ's crucifixion happens while the Romans rule. And in AD 64, it begins the persecution of the Christians under the Nero. In AD 70, They go back to Jerusalem. They destroy the Jerusalem under Titus, and they destroy the second temple. And in AD 313, Emperor Constantine the Great issues Edict of Milan, where Christianity becomes sort of legalized, if you can call it that way. In AD 395, the empire is divided. It's divided into Western Roman Empire and Eastern Roman Empire. And in AD 476, fall of Western Roman Empire. So Rome, as a republic, ceased to exist. Now, we'll look at this in our different studies of what exactly that means. But the Eastern Roman Empire, which did not have the authority to rule, but it ruled through the church. So it was not a secular, but it was a church rule. We'll look at that later. So what happens afterwards? And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of pottery clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of its the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with clay. And as the toes and feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. And whereas thou sawest iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. So after the Roman Empire fell, we have 10 toes, or we have 10 kingdoms that sort of emerged from under Roman rulership. So we have the Anglo-Saxons, which becomes England. We have Franks, which becomes France. We have the Alemanni, which becomes Germany. Visigoths, Spain, Suevi, Portugal, Lombards, Italy, Burundians, it becomes Switzerland. And we have 3 other kingdoms, Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths. At a later date, when we do a study on Daniel chapter 5, we will see that there were 3 horns that were plucked out. I'll just briefly go into that. So these powers were removed because they were opposing the authority of Roman bishop. And they were simply plucked out to allow the Roman church to spread. Again, we will see that later. So the Herulites were removed in 493, the Vandals in 534, and the Ostrogoths in 538. They were not just removed, they were completely annihilated. So this is where we come to the end of the statue. So what happens after the 10 toes? Well, Daniel chapter 2 verse 44 tells us that in the days of this king shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and shall stand forever. So the question is, where are we today? Well, obviously, based on this, we understand that we live in the 10 toes, in the divided kingdoms. In our next study, we will dive to see how does Western Rome and Western Empire and Eastern Empire Rome, how do they play, what kind of role do they play in, and how does it all fit in the prophecy, and where do we stand in regards to that? So, where do we stand in regards to that? So with that being said, I pray that God gives us wisdom and understanding to look at this and to realize that God is always true in His timeline. And the only reason why all of this exists is because people did not listen and follow God's plan. So the question is, are you and I following God's plan? Amen. Let us conclude with